All right, we are going to look at scriptures later. We're going to look at scriptures later. What I'm going to do, though, is begin continuing off at the Fundamentalists and Baptists. Then we're going to get to the big thing, the restoration of Israel. So we have reached that timeline, okay? We have reached that timeline. Remember, World War II has finished. And you've seen the elites. You've seen how the devil spread apostasy throughout the churches during the time of World War I and World War II. That was where he got the victory. That's where we ended up with today's current elite system and apostasy in seminaries and churches everywhere, okay? And then the schools obviously dominated and influenced our next generations. So we have reached that timeline of where it began, the evil spread. Continuing on in our teachings, we're going to leave off where the Fundamentalists and the Baptists came to the scene. Now, remember that the Bible believers came from the Fundamentalists, okay? Fresh review. Let me be quick. That way I can read the rest of the stuff. Is that the Fundamentalists were people who were discontent with the modernism that was spreading all over. So remember, during the Great Awakening revivals, it wasn't a big deal about denominations that time. The reason why we make a big deal about denominations today is because doctrine is more concentrated upon today due to so much false doctrine spreading during these times. All right, Philadelphia didn't have that much. They were free from the chains of Rome. They had good beginnings in America. You just had to avoid Calvinism and some wrong doctrines, but pretty much everything spiritually was really good. Baptists were always the ones that were closest to right doctrine, and they held the fort, and you're going to see that later on. Right. So then the Fundamentalists had to come to the scene. Now remember, we've seen Presbyterians and Methodists, and obviously the Baptists, that mostly fell along that category. But as Dr. Ruckman mentioned, the Baptists were the ones that held out at the end. Because the interdenominational group in the Fundamentalists, they didn't make an emphasis on doctrine as the Baptists. That's our problem as Baptists. We stand for right doctrine, amen? That has always been our problem. That's why they hate us, all right? But doctrine has been the crucial key you've seen, especially today, where you can find what's right and wrong. Without right doctrine, then you get deceived. So then the Baptists were the ones that were more powerfully standing out in the Fundamentalists. Presbyterian, Methodists, and other denominations were there too, but they were dying out. We've seen a few examples with Mordecai Ham. We've seen Bob Jones Sr. And then we've also talked about J. Frank Norris. Now remember, the J. Frank Norris is the guy who came from the Baptist bunch in that Fundamentalist branch. Remember, there's the interdenominational and then the Baptist. The one who stood out is J. Frank Norris with the Baptist. But remember, even the Baptist, which is the Southern Baptist Convention that time, they're starting to apostatize, all right? They're not apostatizing yet. They're starting to apostatize. You're going to see later on some very good Southern Baptists. As a matter of fact, really good preachers are from Southern Baptists. They make killer outlines. Pastor Dennis Knowles was from there. Pastor Mike Fernandez was from there. That's why when you hear their expository preaching, they're very killer in it. They're killer in outlines, all right, the Southern Baptists. Listen to some of their preaching today. It's phenomenal. But the Southern Baptists, they started to apostatize. So J. Frank Norris calls them a ruckus. He was the one mainly responsible for starting the Independent Baptists. That's where we come from, the Independent Baptists. Our church is Baptist, but it's an Independent Baptist. But more so, remember, from the branch of Fundamentalists. Hence, we're called IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist, all right? That's where we come from, all right? But continue on the years, you'll hear about Bible-believing truth later, all right? Remember, it's building up, all right, through our history. So that's where we come from. We all caught up now, right? All right. Now, let's continue on this branch of Fundamentalist and Baptist. Remember, we're at that timeline. Now, Charles Fuller. All right, this is a man which had the old-fashioned Revival Hour radio program. This is on page 252 of Dr. Ruckman's book, The History of the New Testament Church, Volume 2. Between World War I and World War II, Charles Fuller, 1887 to 1968, showed American evangelicals how to broadcast the gospel. And for nearly 20 years, every major Christian radio program that broadcast a service followed Fuller's format. He's the one that paved the way for that, a lot of Bible radio programs. Jack Chick got saved from Charles Fuller radio ministry, all right? But we'll come to his life later on, all right, when we come across the Bible believers. We're not at the Bible believers yet, all right? Charles Fuller began his ministry as a Baptist pastor of a New Testament local church. It's always a Baptist, see? It's always a Baptist. His first broadcast was called the Pilgrim Hour, and it began on one station, KGER, and was broadcast from the church auditorium. 2 more stations were added, KFI and KNX, and then he took a step of faith to get on a network. It meant that his former bill, $1,441 a week, would be raised to $4,500. God answered prayer, and Fuller wound up with a worldwide broadcast coming out of the Andes Mountains over shortwave. Eventually, he made 33 RPM transcriptions for the armed forces overseas, and these were broadcast in the Southwest Pacific and the European theater during World War II. The correspondence of the old-fashioned revival hour, that's the name of his program, justifies itself. If you go to BibleBelievers.com, they play portions of that, all right? BibleBelievers.com. All right. Here's a quote. 3 weeks ago, I wrote you that I had listened to your program. Okay, so here are some letters he received from his radio, all right? 3 weeks ago, I wrote you that I had listened to your program and had become a Christian. Liquor had ruined my life and brought me to the gutter. I was known to the police, and nothing else but the gospel could have saved me. I have returned to the church and attended both services today. My wife is so happy. Here's another letter. I was saved under your ministry 1 year ago. This has been the greatest year of my life. Before I was saved, I was a terrible sinner, but the Lord Jesus Christ has made me a new creation. I am the happiest man in the world. I never dreamed that there was such peace and happiness to be had. Signed, a sinner saved by grace. All right, here's another letter. Here's another letter. My past is black with sin. I have been drinking, and as a whole, I have been a very great sinner. Since I've listened to your message, I have thought it all over and would like to become a Christian. Will you please pray for me? You don't think it's too late for me to come to Christ, do you? Wow. All right, so that's Charles Fuller. And then you get Fuller Theological Seminary that went all apostate. Yeah. See, all the seminaries apostatize. You start with greats, and then it just goes down. Every dispensation ends with what, church? Apostasy. Always. Always starts good and then goes downhill. Always. All right. Now, T.T. Shields. All right, here's another guy you want to know, T.T. Shields. 1873 to 1955. He's a Canadian. Stood with the old guard. He had no formal college or seminary training. Okay, so this is a good sign already, right? So he was well equipped to straighten out the bungling stupidity of the college professors in McMaster's University in Hamilton, Ontario, which was a training school for preachers in Ontario, and the Quebec Convention. Shields pastored the Jarvis Street Baptist Church in Toronto and carried on a lifelong war against the heresies of the Roman Catholic Church and the intrusion of Catholics into politics to obtain Protestant tax money for their own religious ends. The Prime Minister of Canada, W.L. Mackenzie King, was just as good a target for Shields' abusive language as any prostitute in Canada. Shields, like his friends, J. Frank Norris, other people, was often rude in speech, though not in knowledge. Makes you curious. You want to look up what his preaching, right? Yeah. His modest profession was that he was a soldier in the field. Amen. All right, W.B. Riley. Now, this is a very important name, okay? The reason why is, remember, he was a guy that really tried to get keep the Baptists together. He's from Southern Baptist, all right, one of those big guys. W.B. Riley is one of those big Southern Baptist church names. But he tried to get the Northern Baptists together, all right? So there's a Northern Baptist, Southern Baptist. He tried to keep the Baptists going. This guy is so important in our history because Jerry Falwell, remember I told you, Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham, according to Dr. Upman's church history book, were profoundly influenced by him. All right, so W.B. Riley is so important. Now Liberty University, you can kick them with your left foot and it just spews out apostasy. And then Billy Graham's crusades have been all compromised. But anyway, remember, you start out well, then you go apostasy, always, all right? All right, so W.B. Riley believed the AV of 1611 was infallible and, quote, handed down from heaven, end of quote. Yeah. And except for one or two occasions where his old nature got the upper hand, and he tried to impress someone with his knowledge. R.A. Torrey and Spurgeon both did this a few times. So W.B. Riley, he's one of those educated guys. So like Spurgeon and Torrey, all right? Yeah. Remember, when you dabble with education, what happens? Yeah. Right? You always touch, you just touch some wrong stuff. So you got to be careful of that. Riley stuck with the book. As Norris, like J. Frank Norris, he studied at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. Riley blamed Charles Darwin and German rationalism for the apostasy taking place in the Baptist conventions. So he's one of those fundamentalists who stood the ground against modernism that time. Remember, German rationalism was spreading its apostasy in the seminaries, as well as Darwin's evolution in the schools. He said the problem, this is real good, he said the problem should be laid at the feet of culture, this time German culture. Riley was called by his friends a second Martin Luther. Wow. All right. So this is what you get from W.B. Riley. He's very important, where we're going to come across Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, and the other guys later on. So pausing on the fundamentalists, all right, and Baptists, there are two things you want to know in the meantime. The populace, all right, Baptist influence is spreading really wide, more powerfully than the other denominations, believe it or not. All right, because that's, remember, America started with Baptist distinctive. The Lord's blessing falls upon those who fall on right doctrine. So then, Baptist influence is very profound. They're taking over more of the fundamentalists. Also, dispensationalism was taking over, and guess who it's attracting? The Baptists. The Schofield Reference Bible during that time, according to Dr. Ruckman, all right, this is interesting what Dr. Ruckman says on page 159 of his same book. He writes concerning about this Schofield Reference Bible became the means of keeping nearly, listen, half the Baptist ministers in America teaching premillennialism, when the schools they attended and graduated from were teaching amillennialism. Because remember, who are the educated bunch? Those Catholics, all right? Calvinists, excuse me, for the Protestant group. It's Calvinists, that amillennial, postmillennial bunch. But anyway, A.T. Robertson was the apostate fundamentalist at Louisville who taught Calvin's heresy. And other apostate fundamentalists at Judson, Mercer, Stetson, Clark College, and Baylor had revived the ancient heresy of Augustine and Jerome and were teaching postmillennialism. J. Frank Norris kept the Baptists straight on modernism and separation, and Schofield kept them straight on the second coming. If any Southern Baptist showed up between 1910 and 1970 that were soul-winning, Orthodox men, some examples like Billy Graham, J. Harold Smith, Chris Will, R.G. Lee, etc., somewhere on them or under their books in their offices would be found two books: Clarence Larkin's Dispensational Truth and the Old Schofield Reference Bible of 1909. This is interesting. Before the Russian Revolution, 1917, the Schofield Board of Editors had identified Russia under Ezekiel 38 through 39 as the rising world power. This was done from the English text of the AV without any reference to the ASV or RV. Pettingill and Gray were active on this board. All right, so notice that the Schofield Reference Bible had a profound influence. Here's what Dr. Ruckman said on page 271 about Clarence Larkin. Clarence Larkin was the man who taught every prophetic teacher in America from 1930 to 2000 everything they knew about the basics of prophecy and rightly dividing the words of truth. Larkin was a Baptist pastor. All right, page 271. Now, this is from Frederick Widowson's book, all right? his book, A Bible Believer's Guide to World History. And actually, this will be the last time I'm quoting his book, because he ends it here with World War II. But he says on page 345, quote, Clarence Larkin, Baptist Bible commentator and author, published his landmark Dispensational Truth and several Bible commentaries in the early part of the century. Modern end times commentators like Hal Lindsey borrow heavily from his exhaustive approach to the books of Revelation and Daniel. I am sure there were many other very important soul-winning evangelists, and I don't mean to exclude anyone's favorite old-time preacher, but time does not allow us to examine every one. On the other hand, one of the most important liberal preachers mentioned before, a supporter of evolution, modernism, and a denier of the supernatural fundamentals of the Bible, his name is, yes, Harry Emerson Fosdick, all right, famous guy, whose famous sermon, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? See, the fundamentalists were at war with modernism that time. Was in opposition to everything the former mentioned men believed. All right, what's the fruit of modernism, all right? He supported appeasement for Hitler prior to World War II as well. Now, what you're going to find out, a lot of these apostates were like holding hands with elites and Nazis, all right? You'd be surprised. So during that, that's the fruits. Remember, that's the fruits of the apostates. What about the Baptists and fundamentalists? Our fruits have always proved to be superior, have always proven to be the best. That's why we stick to this bunch. Amen. The modern Bible versions, remember, came out that time. The American Standard Version of the Bible was first published in 1901, based on the Revised Version of Westcott and Hort. To bring all Bible versions into line for marketing purposes, the Authorized Version of the Bible, which was once also known as the Common Bible, had its name changed to King James Version, so it would stand in the same ranking as any other three-letter abbreviation, such as ASV. How about that? Sneaky guys. All right, now this is post-World War II, all right? So notice this is all happening same time. Before I tell you details of post-World War II, this was cahoots during that time of fundamentalists spreading good fruit. The apostates and the modernists spreading bad fruits, all right? Having collaboration with Nazis, including some famous Greek Hebrew scholars, all right? The modern version people, all right? You're going to find that out. Dispensationalism was spreading out rampantly that time. Thanks to and that influence is really keeping the Baptist straight in doctrine. So that's why we ended up where we're at with dispensationalism, see? And the KJV has always been the heritage, remember, the only Bible. But now the new Bibles are coming in, and it's all falling apart. So remember all this information. That's all crucial. It's going to combine together as we come here to post-World War II era now, all right? And you're going to hear all of that. All right, you're going to hear the IFBs. You're going to hear the Bible version issue, Nazis and missionaries, Baptists, and etc. All that during post-World War II time. So here's what Frederick Whittleson said on pages 388 to 389. Here we go. A lot of reading here. Stalin. Okay, so World War II is done. Remember. Now remember, Stalin is supposed to be a very good man, right? FDR had to play hands with the devil, all right? Which devil would he pick? He chose Stalin at the end rather than Hitler. Now, here we go. Stalin broke every agreement he made at Yalta, and it was said that FDR had sold out, appeasing Stalin in a similar way that Chamberlain had appeased Hitler. Harry Truman was the president at the Potsdam Conference in July. Here, an ultimatum was issued to Japan that if it did not surrender its armed forces, that its homeland would be destroyed. All right, I already read that part a long time ago. What happened right here is the Japanese tried to reply through the USSR, all right, those communists, Russia, with who, if you remember, they were not at war at the time. The Kremlin, the seat of government in Moscow, under Stalin, did not pass the message on. And Truman, thinking the Japanese had refused to reply, ordered the dropping of the bombs. The Nuremberg war crimes trials began. So those Nazis now are getting their payday. On November 20th, 1945, and resulted in the execution of 10 top-ranking Nazis, the suicide of Goering, and long imprisonments for many others. Gerhard Kittel, all right? You ever heard that name? If you're into lexicons, This is the big name, and people still use his Greek books. Gerhard Kittel, whose theological works were part of the basis for the New International Version of the Bible, NIV, was one of the Nazis imprisoned for his part in the destruction of millions of Jews. By their fruits you shall know them. Yeah. Wonderful modern Bible version people. Kittel not only had a hand in destroying the seed of Israel, but in trying to destroy the incorruptible seed of God's word. In China, after the Japanese had surrendered on August 10th, but before the official surrender ceremony on September 2nd, an event happened that signified the Cold War to come. John Birch, American Baptist missionary and former student at J. Frank Norris's Fundamental Bible Baptist Institute, had become a second lieutenant with Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. He had helped Doolittle's men escape the Japanese when they crash-landed. On August 25th, this American hero was murdered by Chinese communists as he and a party of Chinese and Koreans attempted to free Allied prisoners from a Japanese concentration camp. The John Birch Society was founded in 1958 in his memory, and another American hero who was murdered by the Soviets in the 1980s, Larry McDonald, had been president of the society while a member of Congress. General MacArthur became the military governor of Japan and instituted a tribunal to try senior Japanese officers for war crimes in Tokyo. There were over 2,000 other trials in various countries of lesser officials and military men. The Japanese military had committed mass murder, mass rape, used the forced labor of American POWs to enrich companies like Mitsubishi, machine gun Australian nurses, and executed many Allied POWs and civilians of conquered countries. Even acts of cannibalism on living POWs had been reported. MacArthur's merciful and enlightened reign over the conquered Japan was a determinant in the country's incredible recovery from disaster to be one of America's strongest friends. MacArthur pleaded with American Christians to send missionaries as Japan was ripe for the harvest. You would wonder why Japan is one of the hardest places to give the gospel. You wonder why? However, American Christians, for most part, ignored the call. It's our fault. Yeah. Does that burden you about souls? About soul winning? Burdens us, right? It's our fault. That's why they're going to hell now, Japan. They had a chance. They had a huge chance right here. This is interesting. Peter Sturgis Ruckman, son of a colonel working on the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb, grandson of the World War I general and descendant of Civil War veterans John and Wilson Ruckman, served in the occupation forces, as did one of my uncles. Frederick Whittleson, he's talking about himself. My uncle, in one of his letters to my father, reported that the stench of death was everywhere in late 1945. Japan was a ruined nation. All right, we'll come back to Ruckman later on, okay? But he's undoubtedly a part of our history. MacArthur was a staunch anti-communist and would later pay a high cost for his stance. General Patton in Europe had wanted to carry his war to Soviet Union in anticipation of the wars to come, thinking that then was the time to defeat the communists. But Eisenhower and Truman held him back. He was supposedly killed in a car accident, but many insist he was actually murdered. Now, like I told you, during World War II, too many funny, strange things were going on there. Why? Because it's not a surprise. Remember back at World War I, the Round Table and elites, they already had their hands in a lot of government agencies, okay? And those elites in American government offices were doing their own thing as well. So there's just too many conspiracies that time. It was during that time you found UFOs. So it's during that time. It was when? It was when modern versions came out. It was when modern versions came out, the secret elite round table came out, and all hell broke loose. And conspiracies came out. All right, it's that time. That's a crucial time that Laodicea entered and Philadelphia ended. So I cannot stress that enough. You got to remember that, okay? World War II had cost the lives of between 50 and 60 million people, including 15 million military personnel and anywhere from 35 to 45 million civilians. The numbers are staggering. 2,850,000 German soldiers alone died, with 7,250,000 wounded. The United States lost, by comparison, 292,100 dead and 571,822 wounded. The figures are staggering. At this point, the Soviet Union stands astride Eastern Europe and has actually gotten the most out of the war. It will take over 40 years of conflicts, proxy wars with America before the communist monster falls. Then it will be replaced by an Islamo-fascist monster that rises out of its ashes, keeping in mind that Saddam Hussein's hero was not Mohammed, but Joseph Stalin. Israel, after a 2,000-year absence, is about to take its place again among the nations of the world. Britain will lose its empire, and America will take its place as the dominant country on earth and as the nurturer of Israel. A few more twists and turns will take place before Satan can unite the world of men against the God who created them. And that is the end of Frederick Whittleson's book.
Wow.
All right, that's his end of world history. Wow. But we don't end it there. We're starting Laodicea. All right.
Wow.
All right. So now you see how they're connected. Our history, it's so important that time. Post World War II. That's where all the action's at. Okay. Now we come to Israel. All right. England has lost its dominant role more and more. We've seen that. All right. During the end of Queen Victoria's timeline, then we enter to the other queens, and now its current king. England just went downhill, total apostasy. America became alive. Why? Because of these guys. These guys held the fort. If it weren't for these guys, America would have went downhill a long time ago. But America also did another thing. Not just the Christians. It's support for Christians, but it's support for the nation of Israel. Because Britain lost its hand on it, and America supported them on that. That's the reason why America still remained. Yeah. But now, what you're seeing America is, it's falling apart super duper fast now. Yeah. All right, everything's going to hell. All right, everything's going to hell. But let's begin. This is an incredible story from Dr. William Grady's book, Holy Ground, True History of the State of Israel. I don't know if I can finish everything here, but this is incredible, the story, all right? So I'm going to read as much as I can. Here we go. Roosevelt, okay, so remember FDR, right? So this is after World War II. So now Israel's getting attention. Why? Because of the Holocaust. So they can't be ignored anymore now. What are you going to do with the Jews? Because in Europe, they've been mistreated. The communists are coming. Where else can they go but? All right? But they loved Europe so much, but God took away their materials. Where now I got no home here anymore. Time to go back. All right, here we go. Roosevelt believed he could, page 405 of Grady's book. Roosevelt believed he could use his personal charm, as he had with Stalin, not only to secure renewed U.S. oil and landing rights on the Arabian Peninsula, but shore up Jewish votes as well by persuading Saud. So Saud is the guy who represents the Arabs there, to adopt more flexibility on Zionism. Was he ever in for a shock? When Saud refused to consider further Jewish immigration to Palestine, much less statehood, the president gingerly mentioned that, quote, 3 million Jews had been murdered in Poland alone, end of quote. Whereupon the Muslim bluntly replied, quote, there must be room for 3 million more, end of quote. Nearly falling out of his wheelchair, FDR promptly assured his guests that, quote, he would do nothing to assist the Jews against the Arabs and would make no move hostile to the Arab people, nor would his government change its policy on Palestine without full and prior consultation with both Jews and Arabs, end of quote. official U.S. policy would now be pro-Arab, quote, neutrality. Back on Capitol Hill, Roosevelt told Congress, quote, on the problem of Arabia, I learned more about that whole problem, the Muslim problem, the Jewish problem, by talking with Ibn Saud for 5 minutes than I could have learned in an exchange of 2 or 3 dozen letters, end of quote. He then reaffirmed his pledge to Saud in a letter dated April 5th, signed in his, quote, capacity as chief of the executive branch of the government, end of quote. However, about the time, quote, His Highness was showing off his official Oval Office keepsake, another chief executive was already calling the shots. Reflecting upon FDR's April 12th death, David Niles, a Zionist Jew and presidential advisor, mentioned this, quote, there are serious doubts in my mind that Israel would have come into being if Roosevelt had lived. So if FDR continued, then Israel may not have gotten its nation. All right, what did the Lord do? All right. So before I continue on, now we come across verses, all right? So first of all, I want you to go to Daniel 10, all right? I'm going to try to make this brief. That way I can read these quotes, because I'm sure you're more interested to hear the story. But I have to give these verses first because, unfortunately, we got people who don't know doctrine, all right? Such babes in Christ, and they don't know, all right? They watch too much stuff online, and they think they know everything. Yeah, they know whatever they watch. They didn't read the book, right? They weren't reading the Bible. Sometimes just ask them the question, how many times have you read through that Bible, compared to how many hours you watched on YouTube, all right? See? All right, so Daniel chapter 10. First things first. Now, remember this. Elites are everywhere, all right? Including the round table have had its hand in everybody. If you're going to start your own nation, I got a question, all right? You're not going to make some dealing with some elite out there? Well, obviously, because the elites have their hands in everything. If you're going to start your own nation, this is indisputable. You're going to bump into an elite somewhere. Right. Conspiracy theorists, because they find a certain elite and a name connected to a Jew who's trying to start his nation, all of a sudden they prove that, see, the Jews were all in on it. Come on, bro, man. So I'm going to give you 2 cases right here in the scripture. It's been common, even the scriptures reveal, that the Jews, when they got their nation restored, all right, they had to make dealings or they had to go through the devil's elites, all right? There's no doubt about that. I'm going to give you 2 passages, all right? I'm going to give you 2 passages. It's easy for you to accuse anybody of conspiracy when you're locked up inside your room without any social activity, without talking to anybody. That's obvious, all right? But if you go out in the real world and you're very socially active and you talk to people, or you have to do something big to start like a big company or especially a nation, guess what? Whether you and I like it or not, you're going to bump into one of the elites somewhere. Yep. Why? Because their hands are everywhere, all right? Now, here's one example. Daniel chapter 10. Now, who was one of the angels fighting with? In Daniel 10:13. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Now notice that an angelic being was fighting with the king of Persia. Now that ain't no normal king of Persia. Then that's who? Satan. That's Satan. Why? Because the kings or the elites of Persia were under his rule. The conspiracy about the Aryan race came from Zoroastrianism, and that came from Persia. You didn't know that? So all that came from Persia as well. But it was what? Those evil elites or Persian kings that restored the nation of Israel. Right? And then the Jews, they had to talk to them so that they can get their nation restored. What are you going to do about that? If that's not enough, here's a better one. Joseph didn't he save his people? Yep. Who did he have to go through? Duh, all right? A pagan guy who was keeping Nimrod Semiramis' evil religion alive, Pharaoh. Whoa. And this was a Jew. A Jew who had power, who was an elite, and who had power to save his own people while other Gentiles had to go through him. Joseph, a Jewish elite who had control from from Pharaoh, from an evil Egyptian system. And so then Joseph must be an evil, bad dude, right? He's not used by the Lord at the book of Genesis. Come on. You know what the Lord does? A lot of people don't think this. People think the Lord will only use good people to fulfill his purpose. The Lord uses anybody, including the devil, as his pawn piece to accomplish his goal and plan. You better get that through your head. Get the memo? Amen, brother. All right. So we see this example. We're not going to read these passages, but a great example is the book of Genesis. And then chapter, let's see right here. Genesis chapter 47. Genesis chapter 47. When you read that whole passage, it's amazing. A Jewish elite tries to save his own people, his nation, while working together with what? Evil elites. The Egyptians still had their priests, their worship. And Joseph had to do that. He had to work with those guys. And he's the greatest typology of Jesus Christ, not the Antichrist. All right, is that enough to convince you? All right. If that's not enough, go to my playlist about the nation of Israel. I have so much over there, all right? I have so much over there, proving that in the Bible, you have to be a supporter of the nation of Israel. Do we recognize corruption in Israel? Of course. Just like our government, just like our Christian church. Right. You think you're better than the Jew? Come on, man. So everybody is corrupt, all right? But that don't mean that, I can't support anybody. Then you got nobody to support but just yourself, locked up in your own room, and you think everybody's corrupt except you. Oh, did I just talk about you just now? Yeah. All right.
Come on, brother.
Some of you must not be married. All right, then. All right. When you get married, then you start to learn about making dealings and reality, all right? And no one's perfect like you, okay? All right, now, going back, all right? Let's go back to page, let's see right here. So, Dr. Grady's book, and I'll continue reading some of the stories he has here. All right, so I have a lot of markings here. Here we go, page 413. When scores of Shoah survivors were surveyed as to their preferred destination, over 85% replied what? Those who survived the Holocaust and all the oppression that the Jews went through. You know what their preferred destination is? You can guess. They called it Eretz Yisrael. Now remember, Eretz Yisrael was the original name before the nation of Israel was born. That was proof that there were always Jews there and they never left their homeland. I went through a long spiel on that last time, right? So I don't have to do it again. Dr. Michael Robert Morris of the University of Toronto writes in The Unwanted, quote, "The Jews in Central Europe," this is important, this is why they were able to go back. "The Jews in Central Europe had little desire to return to their countries of origin, often seen as a graveyard for the Jews. With more authority than the Harrison Inquiry, the committee reported that the Jewish DPs wanted desperately to go to Palestine. Of 138,320 Jewish DPs enumerated in the British, American, and French zones, 118,570 declared Palestine their preferred destination." All right. All right, that's page 413 of Dr. Grady's book. All right, I had to read a lot. I'm not going to read you this whole thing here, all right? So I made some markings that I'll have to read through quickly. All right, here's another one. Continuing on the story about the Jews and how they were able to come back home. All right, skip. Sorry, you're going to have to put up with me here. All right, now this is important what they were at odds against. There's no doubt God's hand is behind this whole thing, all right? Naval Secretary James V. Forrestal, all right? These are the important names. These are the guys who did not want those Jews to go back home, all right? Guess what? He's a fanatical Catholic. They don't want them back, all right? Vatican didn't recognize this as a nation until many years, scores of years later, actually. Catholics don't want them back, all right? Remember, who has been the enemy from beginning of church history to now? Rome. Never forget Rome, all right? Rome has always been the enemy. All right, continuing on. Let's see right here. The former president, this guy, Forrestal, look at his connections with the elites, all right? He's America's first Secretary of Defense in September 1947. Former president of Wall Street, behemoth, Dillon, Red and Company, which was one of Hitler's main banks. The ringleader of a certain group at the State Department and intelligence officials, conspiring with the likes of John and Allen Dulles, St. John Jack Philby, King Saud, and the U.S. oil lobby against the Zionist bid for statehood. This guy, all right, he's a behemoth, this guy, of an elite. If the Jews want it back, they're going to need a miracle. Forrestal's key allies were General of the Army George C. Marshall and Undersecretaries of State Dean Axon and Robert Levet. All right, so these names are important. You're going to have to remember them. Why is U.S. more pro-Arab than pro-Israel? You could probably guess. By 1947, America's petroleum giants controlled 42% of Middle Eastern reserves, primarily in Saudi Arabia, though also in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Iraq. As the Saudi-U.S. relationship blossomed, Arab output grew from 21.3 million barrels in 1945 to 142.9 million in 1948, three years. Quote, the prestige and hence the influence of the United States is in part related to the wealth of the government and its nationals in terms of oil resources. End of quote, Forrestal wrote. Adding, quote, indeed the active expansion of such holdings is much to be desired, Forrestal said. Jim lectured the pro-Zionist Clark Clifford, quote, you just don't understand. There are 400,000 Jews and 40 million Arabs. 40 million Arabs are going to push 400,000 Jews into the sea. And that's all there is to it. Oil, that is the side we ought to be on. This is amazing. This 1%, it's amazing, kicked all the Arab nations' tails and survived with all that odds. There's no doubt, there's got to be a divine hand right here, all right? But I'm just beginning the story, all right? They're at odds. There's no way they're going to be a nation, all right? But continue reading on. With the looming red menace sealing the argument, the communists, right? Everybody accusing everyone to be a communist that time. Truman's biographer wrote, quote, when his Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, reminded him of the critical need for Saudi Arabian oil in the event of war, Truman said he would handle the situation in light of justice, not oil. Now, Truman is a very interesting character. Did he have elite connections? Yes. There's a whole shelf just on his Masonic connections. But can God use a person like that to do something? It's amazing. Even the king of Persia, the pagan kings, Pharaoh and all that, Nebuchadnezzar, those guys, they had a conscience. And it's amazing how the Lord used it, all right? But here we go, all right? The story's just beginning, all right? Now, what are the Jews going to do? They're in trouble, right? They're at odds. David Ben-Gurion, he's a big key player for the Jews where they're able to get back their nation. Now, the Jews, they're not, they got connections too, right? They're rich people too, right? All right, so look what they did. Page 430. According to the initial ad hoc voting pattern, several central, this is the key, several Central and South American nations, they're pro-Vatican, had facilitated in favor of the Arabs. All right. But the Jews are able to turn that because of the South American votes. This is how they did it. On the second part of the first subcommittee resolution, 6 voted against the Israeli position. They are Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, El Salvador, and Haiti. While 5 abstain, which are Bolivia, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, and Nicaragua. In their best showing, the generic procedural vote, 5 abstentions remained, along with 1 absentee nation, Paraguay. Thus, Truman told Acting Secretary of State Lovett to intensify U.S. pressure on the Latin bloc. However, as Ben-Gurion knew well the anti-Semitic cabal within the Truman administration, so this is all elites against elites against elites, all right? Who has the bigger players? Because remember this, Jews are not saved Christians, remember, all right? So they are going to use secular means to accomplish their goals. The Jews are very clever people, actually, all right? The Lord blessed them with that, and that's the reason why their pride got to them, and they all messed up, right? All right, but anyway, continuing on. Ben-Gurion decided to procure his own hedge against the uncertain Latino vote, as well as a number of recent surprise abstentions by various Western nations. So they're trying to summon up votes with the United Nations, okay? They have a council there that does the votes with the nations. So the South America was key right here, South America. So how are the Jews going to do it? To shore up the former, the Zionists paid an impromptu visit to the one American who carried the ultimate clout in that part of the world, Nelson Rockefeller. That's the guy. They knew that they could talk to him. In July 1940, FDR appointed Rockefeller to the new position of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Now look at Rockefeller's elitist connections. Ostensibly a cultural intelligence post to further the standing and security of the U.S. in the Southern Hemisphere. Of course, Rocky would use it. Grady calls him Rocky, all right? Rocky would use it to further his own security. Fuel sales to Nazi Germany via neutral Spain. Remember Spain's connection with Vatican and the Nazis? Rockefeller had dealings with them. Thus, his government staff would exploit the war by coordinating the Latin market for his corporate staff, while Britain and other capitalist nations in Europe were being denied a legitimate piece of the action. Loftus and Ahrens relate, quote, all through the war, at least while Rockefeller was in charge, everything the Germans wanted in South America, they got, from refueling stations to espionage bases. And don't forget those rat lines, remember? That the Nazi the leaders escaped through, those tunnels. It's all South America. And remember, mainly it's Catholic. All right, you cannot escape Catholic conspiracy here. Right. After all, this was the least he could do, given that Farben held the second largest share of the Rockefeller-controlled Standard Oil Company. This is page 431. Now I'm reading page 432. This is what the Jews did, all right? According to Loftus and Ahrens, British, American, and Israeli intelligence insiders confided that Rockefeller played a significant, albeit involuntary, role in the United Nations vote concerning Israel. How? Loftus and Ahrens wrote this. Ben-Gurion had already accumulated more than enough ammunition against Rockefeller and had decided that he could not take any chances with an indirect approach. There was no time for a British-style media campaign. The Latin American votes were needed in 3 days. How are they going to get that real quickly? Our American sources insist that the Jews simply laid their cards on the table for Nelson Rockefeller to read and blackmailed the H-E-double-L out of him. They blackmailed him. Why? Because of his Nazi connections. Yeah, right. Okay, end of quote. The author's Israeli contact identified Ben-Gurion Intel director and future pioneer Mossad chief Reuven Shiloah as the mastermind of the 11th hour shakedown. For Nelson Rockefeller, the timing could not have been worse. In a landmark civil case just 2 months earlier, federal judge Charles Clark ruled, quote, Standard Oil, that's Rockefeller's group, can be considered an enemy national in view of its relationships with I.G. Farben after the United States and Germany had become active enemies, end of quote. Rockefeller, coolly examined the incriminating dossier. The contents were devastating. His Swiss bank records with Germany, his signed correspondence forming the Reich cartel in South America, transcripts and wiretaps of his conversations with Nazi agents during the war, plus plenty of the rat lines. Complicity with Allen Dulles. Nixon's future vice president then issued a staggering counteroffer. This is interesting. Quote, you can have vengeance or you can have a country, but you cannot have both, end of quote. The Jews had to pick. To guarantee the Hispanic bloc, the Jews would have to drop their pursuit of Nazi money and war criminals, especially in the region of interest. Loftus and Ahrens conclude, quote, according to our Israeli informant, whose account was corroborated by several other sources in the intelligence community whom we interviewed subsequently, Ben-Gurion's representative was heartsick. Counter-blackmail had not been in the game plan. He made a telephone call to try to obtain guidance. It took several hours before the reply came, yes. There really was no choice but to give Rockefeller what he wanted. On behalf of the still unborn state of Israel, the promise was formally given to let the Nazis go free. The men who murdered the Jews of Europe were effectively given amnesty, except for the unlucky few who had already been punished. That's very enlightening, right? What you hear in online or conspiracies is only parts of stories. You see that? Just picking up names and dealings. They don't know the whole story, what went on. But if you know the Bible, it makes a lot more perfect sense what was going on. It's simply elites and Jews who've been blessed by God who became elites, all these people. The Lord just used all of them to restore the nation of Israel. That's what the Lord does. Why? Because these people are not going to do it the biblical Christian way. So the Lord don't care. He's going to use, as Proverbs 21 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he'll turn to whomsoever he will. A lot of people don't understand that. When they hear this, they're like, oh, I cannot understand that. You don't understand God, my friend. Right. You really don't understand how God deals with things. All right, page 433. This is interesting. The final UNGA vote, so UNGA, that's the United Nations General Assembly, I think they call it. That's where they do the vote. The UNGA vote was on Saturday, November 29th. Surprisingly to many, Resolution 181 passed by 33-13, with 10 abstentions, a decisive margin of 72%. In the 3-day interim, 8 countries went from abstaining to affirming, while the nays remained at 13. Apart from Cuba and Greece, all dissenting votes were either Arab or Asian. Given the metaphor of skating on thin ice, the Carvinus Gray building had formerly housed an ice rink. Rockefeller had assured Ben-Gurion, private delegation, quote, don't worry, every country in Latin America will either vote in favor of Israel or abstain. See, Ben-Gurion knew what to do. He had to contact Rockefeller. That's how he could get those votes. All right. Interesting story, huh? Yeah. Very interesting what's going on, everything. All right. Now, page 438. This is very interesting, all right? They're not happy, all right? Page 438. James Forrestal used the anticipated unrest to launch his own counteroffensive against the tenuous U.S. support for partition. So when they say for partition, that's for that partition of land where the Jews can get it, all right? So the U.S. is going for it. This Catholic ain't going to go for it, all right? This Catholic elitist. Quote, excuse me. On page 438, the anti-Truman forces mobilized a challenge based on national security. So these are people who are against Truman as well, all right? Truman's on tough grounds right here, all right? If you go to his museum, it's very interesting. It's very interesting if you go to his museum, all right? All right, anyway. Thus, a Defense Department leak informed the Associated Press that, quote, U.S. military observers were opposed to partition. So they're opposed to partition, the military. Why? On the grounds that it might put the Red Scare, put Russian troops in the Mediterranean within minutes of flying time from the Suez Canal and American Middle East oil concessions. Oh, those Jews are in trouble now. However, unbeknownst then, Rockefeller was not the only victim of Ben-Gurion's bargaining skills. According to 2 former Israeli agents, the wily Jew told Stalin that the price for his continued silence regarding the still secret Max Turkel network in Eastern Europe was a complete reversal of his former position on Palestine. Those Jews are very clever people, okay? Very clever people. Loftus and Aaron's write, quote, there is evidence that Ben-Gurion's blackmail worked. Suddenly, in 1947, the Soviet Union became one of the leading proponents of partitioning Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. How about that? Facing pressure from George Marshall on February 17th, Truman reluctantly approved a State Department proposal to invoke the powers of the Security Council. Partition would be scrapped for a UN trusteeship. All right. The Jews are going to lose it now. All right. Page 439. The president would later recall, Jewish pressure on the White House did not diminish following the partition vote in the UN. Individuals and groups asked me, usually in rather quarrelsome and emotional ways, to stop the Arabs, to keep the British from supporting the Arabs, to furnish U.S. soldiers, to do this, that, and the other. I think I can say that I kept my faith in the rightness of my policy in spite of some of the Jews. As the pressure mounted, I found it necessary to give instructions that I did not want to be approached by any more spokesmen for the extreme Zionist cause. Truman did not want to talk to any more Jews about the land. That was it. You know what saved it? Truman had a former business partner from Kansas City. That's where the Truman Museum is. His name is Eddie Jacobson. He's a Jew. If it weren't for him, Truman would not have listened to Dr. Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman was that guy who communicated with Truman. And now that's a divine hand of God going all the way back where Jacobson knew Truman from before he became president. This is really crazy, the story. It's really a miracle. So because of that, pointing to, so this is what Jacobson said. Jacobson said to Truman, pointing to a statue of Andy Jackson on a table in the Oval Office, because Truman's hero was Andy Jackson. Jacobson won the day by telling Truman that just as he had a hero in Jackson, Truman, Jacobson, also had a hero in Wiseman. So Wiseman made a 6,000-mile journey from Palestine just to see the president. It was barely at that time. The president, when he first met him, he had a great impression and then called him Cham because he couldn't pronounce his first name well. And they had a good talk. He was known as the Little Doctor or Cham. But both the president and Cham, or Dr. Wiseman, they had a good impression after that visit. All right, what happened after that? Page 440. While they were having their timely chat together, Cham and Truman, Forrestal and his allies were completing what amounted to something of their own. For on the very next day, despite the president's explicit order, I need to screen all major Security Council speeches first, all right? So don't do anything before you say something stupid to UNGA and all that, all right? Austin announced that the U.S. was officially reversing its position on Palestine. These elites and this Catholic, they went behind the scenes, did it behind Truman's back, and did that already. Ostensibly, because war was certain upon the Brits' departure, he asked the council to suspend the partition plan. Oh, that's the problem now. The Zionists were enraged. Rabbi Silva told the Security Council that Austin's recommendation was, quote, a shocking reversal and, quote, a final capitulation to Arab threats. All right, this is a problem. Now what's going to happen? Page 441. Consequently, with His Majesty's government packed and ready to depart, remember England owned all of Israel, right? But then remember the Balfour Declaration. That was the first step. Second step, England was finally leaving because they were sick and tired of Jews and Arabs all going to war with each other and things blowing up. That's why it's still going on today, all right? It's a horrible condition. So England didn't want anything to do with that, so they left. So they're leaving, and 5 Muslim nations preparing to invade, all right? Those Jews are in trouble. They got 5 Muslim nations now onto them as well. And then they got the certain people or certain elites in the U.S. trying to push them away. What can they do, man? What can they do? What happened was, at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, May the 12th, exactly 50 hours to Israeli statehood, all right? 50 hours before Israel declared itself to be a nation. Time is so tight here. George Marshall, remember he's one of those guys, and Lovett, remember he's one of those guys, marched into the Oval Office. So Truman was seated behind his famous plaque. The buck stops here. They're going to fight it out now. Here we go. Clifford recalled the incident. As I talked, I noticed the thunderclouds gathering. Marshall's face getting redder and redder. Here we go. Page 442, the general had certainly heard enough. After trashing Clark's position, Marshall flexed his political muscle and looked right at Truman. Clifford writes the following. Speaking with barely contained rage and more than a hint of self-righteousness, he made the most remarkable threat I ever heard anyone make directly to a president. This is what Marshall threatened. If you follow Clifford's advice, so for the Jews, and if I were to vote in the election, I would vote against you. Everyone in the room was stunned. Now, for some of you who don't know Truman, when he went through his second term, he was in a very tight spot. He could have lost everything as well. McCullough states that the remark regarded by Clifford as, quote, the sharpest rebuke ever for him, end of quote. Instead of pledging his support for a Jewish state, the Secretary of State left Truman in a different state. Quote, there was really a state of shock. The president, I think, was struck dumb by it. There was this awful total silence. So what was Truman? What could he do after that? Truman told Marshall that it's all best we all sleep on the matter. All right? The clock is ticking. All right. The president now had less than 2 days to make the most important decision of his life. Page 444. The next morning, May 14th, Sir Alan Cunningham, Britain's last High Commissioner of Palestine, quit Jerusalem in his bulletproof limousine. So he went. By 4 p.m., some 350 invited guests were assembled at the Tel Aviv Art Museum. Standing before a large frame portrait of Theodore Herzl, flanked by 2 Star of David flags, David Ben-Gurion gavelled the meeting to order, prompting a spontaneous singing of Ha Tikva. The Prime Minister-designate then spent the next 12 minutes reading the Declaration of Independence live over the first legal broadcast of Kol Yisrael. With the signing completed, the crowd rose to its feet as the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra played Ha Tikva. Ben-Gurion then concluded the historic occasion with the words. He cried out, "The state of Israel is established. This meeting is adjourned." What about America? Clock's ticking. They're all sleeping. They're all sleeping on the matter, right? Page 445. Back in the Beltway, at the very moment the Declaration was being read in Tel Aviv, Clifford was on the phone with Eliyahu Epstein, head of the Jewish Agency's political department in Washington, asking that a letter be rushed to Truman before 12 a.m., formally requesting that the United States recognize a new Jewish state. Will he do it? Will he do it? Meanwhile, the discerning Marshall must have had a few restless moments of his own, having slept on the matter. Here we go. Around 4 p.m., Lovett called Clark. "I have talked to the general. He cannot support the president's position, but he has agreed that he will not oppose it." That's enough. With George Marshall sulking, Leavitt promptly rang Truman to confirm that the general had finally recanted. The game of chicken was over. With 2 hours to go, Marshall flinched. As the clock ticked down, Truman was heard to murmur at 5:16 p.m., "The old doctor will believe me now," because earlier he felt like he was lying to him when Marshall went behind his back and did that premature announcement. Finally, at the stroke of midnight, the British mandate, the English control over Israel, terminated, and the Medinat Yisrael, or State of Israel, was officially proclaimed by David Ben-Gurion. Exactly 11 minutes later, 6:11 p.m., Truman's press secretary read the following de facto recognition of the new Jewish state. Quote, "Statement by the President. This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel. Signed, Harry Truman, approved May 14th, 1948. Wow. What a hand of God, man. Yeah. You want to hear something else more interesting? What's the promise? I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee. Yeah. You want evidence? What happened? Page 448. As for James Forrestal, his strike breeches split within months. Just prior to the election, the popular columnist Drew Pearson had exposed the highly unethical Forrestal-Dewey alliance. By late December, Truman also learned that his defense secretary was experiencing a total psychotic breakdown characterized by suicidal features. Forrestal was subsequently asked to tender his resignation. He was getting loony. Whereupon he complied on March 29th. 4 days later, immediately after that, he was confined to the mental ward at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He was losing his mind. In the early hours of May 22nd, 1949, 1 week after the first anniversary of the State of Israel, Forrestal fell to his death from a window near his room on the 16th floor. He reportedly tied his dressing gown sash to a radiator, knotted the other end around his neck, and jumped, the cord breaking in the process. In his final days, Forrestal was allegedly heard, quote, screaming that the Jews and communists were crawling on the floor of his room seeking to destroy him. End of quote. He went mad. Though many conspiracy theorists believe that Forrestal's suicide was something more sinister, a curse by any other name is still a curse. If you mess with the Jew, God will mess with you. But you want a bigger evidence? Grady mentions a very interesting one. America's first supercarrier, the USS Forrestal, all right, the Forrestal, where Navy's highest honor to its former secretary, what happened? It triggered a freak missile launch, and then it fell, it went to ruins, and was sold for, let's see right here, it was sold to a Texas scrap yard at the end for 1 penny. Now, if that ain't something there, that's something there what the Lord did. This is interesting. Let me close it here, page 449, and then you have a good night. To be sure, Truman would make his share of political blunders. Truman's notorious profanity, dancing, poker playing, bourbon drinking, and Masonic affiliation place him way outside of a scriptural testimony, Grady recognizes. At the end of the day, page 450, at the end of the day, so, despite of his many shortcomings, Truman, believe it or not, guys, you didn't know about this, was familiar enough with the Bible, having read it through a dozen times in his youth. If you go to the museum, it's very interesting what life he grew up in. Why? Because those fundamentalists and Baptists were spreading all over. So in spite of a guy who ended up with Masonic elites or some detrimental things, he couldn't escape that Baptist influence. That's all the Lord. Can you see Baptist influence from the beginning of the greatness of America and everything? Do you see that, man? All right. He knew, after reading a dozen times in his youth the Bible, to know where the Jews belonged. Discerning enough to sense his providential role in the prophetic window, and courageous enough to hazard his political career to bring the miracle to fruition, he was at least truer to the scriptural view of Israel than his British nemesis, whose own Baptist affiliation cast him as the key Laodicean locksmith in the closing phase of Israel's struggle for statehood. Luke 12:48. Thus, when Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, chief rabbi of Israel, this is interesting, visited the White House on May 10th, 1949, he stunned Truman by saying, quote, God put you in your mother's womb so you would be the instrument to bring the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. End of quote. David Niles remarked, quote, I thought he was overdoing things, but when I looked over at the president, tears were running down his cheeks. End of quote. And those were not the last tears that he would shed over Eretz Yisrael. On May 8th, 1951, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion visited Washington to present Truman with a menorah for his 67th birthday. 10 years later, the two senior statesmen met again at Ben-Gurion's Waldorf suite. Ben-Gurion's account of their final encounter is a fitting conclusion to this opening section of Holy Ground. Quote, and we'll close it here. At our last meeting, after a very interesting talk, just before the president left me, it was in a New York hotel suite. I told him that as a foreigner, I could not judge what would be his place in American history. But his helpfulness to us, his constant sympathy with our aims in Israel, his courageous decision to recognize our new state so quickly, and his steadfast support since then had given him an immortal place in Jewish history. As I said that, tears suddenly sprang to his eyes, and his eyes, Truman, were still wet when he bade me goodbye. I had rarely seen anyone so moved. I tried to hold him for a few minutes until he had become more composed, for I recalled that the hotel corridors were full of waiting journalists and photographers. He left. A little while later, I too had to go out, and a correspondent came to me to ask, why was President Truman in tears when he left you? End of story.
Wow.
Amazing, huh?
Yeah.
History is so amazing, especially our Baptist history.
Yeah.
Incredible. All right. So much more. All right. What happens to those apostates? All right. What happens to the fundamentalists? Will the Bible believers come out? We're very close to our time. And the devil's elites, they've just began. And the Cold War is happening. You're going to hear Catholic conspiracies all over during the Cold War. And the Russians spying on the Washington, D.C., D.C. spying on them, and Catholics spying on them, and this is a fiasco and a mess. While the fundamentalists were holding their ground. The National Council of Churches, the final apostate church, is coming now to the scene as well, with Billy Graham coming out influenced by fundamentalists. So much more next time, all right. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time we are in, to be honest, Father. We are such in an exciting time, Lord. Many of us do not realize our importance right now, in this world right now, from our history. May we learn from our history and realize there's no better crowd than this that we're at. And stay strong in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.